Welcome everybody to the Cyber Recovery Roundtable. Our session today is going to be talking about how to recover from a destructive cyber attack and some of the technologies, people, and processes that you need to have in place to make sure that you're ready to do so. We've got a panel of our experts today. Arun Krishnamurthy, who's the global lead of our IT transformation services, as well as Carol Elstein, who's a principal solutions partner. We're really excited to be here today to talk more with you, really conversationally about exactly, again, what it's going to take to recover from a cyber attack. So just to set the context a little bit, so cyber attacks have become incredibly common. This is more a matter of when than if organizations are impacted by these now. We see these as a headline almost every day in every market. There are a number of those laid across the slide here. These cyber threats are becoming significantly more sophisticated and really having a devastating impact on those organizations. Now, these happen all the time. Again, we've been seeing these recent attacks at global companies, like some of those you see here. Just to kind of pause on one of them a little bit, the NotPetya far left. That was Maersk, a global shipping giant. They had when they were hit by their attack, they had boats at port unable to be unloaded, boats at port unable to be loaded, boats at sea unable to really do much other than drive to their port and await further instructions. But the key of that all is that their business was incredibly highly impacted by this attack. Because of the amount of systems that they had connected to one another. So once that attack was able to find its way in and make its impact, it was really a truly devastating for that organization. They were down for only a number of days, and their C-level team had to join their earnings call that quarter and declare a roughly $300 million loss for only a few days of being out as a result of that cyber attack. So not only are they happening more frequently, but the impacts are becoming greater and greater. We're seeing this again every day. I mean, if anyone was just following the news even yesterday, a major cyber attack happened within a large U.S. hospital chain. They had employees telling reporters that all of their systems were completely shut down. Now, again, this is something that we're seeing almost on a daily basis, whether it be on a small scale or large scale, but this is happening frequently. And you need to make sure that you've got the technologies, the people and process in place to make sure that you can recover from that. So, Carol, if you could advance one more time for me, please. So we like to talk about recovery as a key enabler of cyber resilience. And the reason that that's one of the keys is that being confident in your ability to recover from an attack is a key driver of that, is a key driver of confidence in recovery. Because if you've gone through the necessary planning and testing processes, all of the necessary things are in place, and by getting your teams comfortable with recovering from those types of attacks is what really drives that overall cyber resilience. So knowing at the end of the day that you've got a last line of defense in place and can recover from an attack if everything else before that in line lets something through. Now, we like to talk about this by focusing in a couple key areas, and we'll detail a lot of those today. You see those 5 elements across the slide here. But basically, you have to start off with a purpose-built technology foundation, building on top of that with the software and the processes necessary to make sure that your teams are enabled and ready to recover. So without further ado, we'll jump into our Q&A session now, talking with some of our experts about really some of the specifics on this slide. We'll talk about some of the technologies that we can enable, some of the softwares and other areas that can help bolster those protections and enable recovery. And then, of course, on the process side to make sure that everything is in place and ready to go. Carol, Arun, I really want to start out, just by talking about, a little bit about the attacks that are happening out there. Now, we've seen that they're happening with incredible frequency and really are becoming more and more devastating, as that continues. But there are a number of different, motivations, goals, techniques of different attackers and different methods they're using. Should the audience focus on any one of those specific aspects or all of them? I mean, I imagine it's harder to focus on all of them, but just wanted to get your thoughts on where to best start understanding the threat landscape.
So I think that if you look at some of the recent reporting, what you'll see is that you need to be overall concerned with attacks that affect multiple sources of your data. And that includes your online data, your backups. What we're seeing is that bad actors have worked in data centers. They know how data centers work. So essentially, in order to do the most damage, they are looking to really impact their backups and snapshots, point-in-time copies, and then work on the production side data. Arun, I think we've also seen insider threats as well. Is that something you want to comment on?
Yeah, absolutely, Carol. So, the one, just to take a step back in terms of the question, right? We are finding that the cyber attack is now the preferred weapon for the bad guys. There's plausible deniability. It takes, when a state-sponsored attack happens, it takes days, weeks to even figure out who may have initiated the attack. Due to lack of traceability and ownership, that's why the cyber attacks are brazen, right? I mean, there's no way to find out. In terms of insider attack, we are starting to see that customers that have rock-solid technologies that have not failed them before, from a security breach perspective, and mainframe is a classic example. It is really built to avoid as much malware type infections and attacks as possible. But the insider attack is where malware can come in, and the dwell time of a malware allows the hackers to really understand the environment, understand the behaviors in the environment, and potentially steal insider credentials, right? And this is a huge problem, and part of the Dell solution, we've really thought about the insider attack very seriously when we build the solution both from a technology standpoint and from a process standpoint.
Yeah, that's a great point, Arun. We like to look at all the various reports and things that come in, and I believe last year's Verizon Data Breach Investigations report indicated almost 30% of attacks had included an insider aspect. So that's a great call out. So to help, kind of make sure that we are addressing all of those various concerns, whether they be from inside or outside, or various types of threat actors, whether they be someone focused on, extortion and money, or if it's someone like you mentioned, it's a nation state actor. What do we generally recommend that customers do to ensure that, that first of all, benchmark any existing capabilities they have, and then ensure that, they're rolling out a new plan or, refining their plan according to a framework? Is there a framework that we generally recommend people use? I mean, I think there's a variety out there that all include some good things, but just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Most of our customers have a significant number of our customers have adopted the Nist cybersecurity framework. It's a great framework. It's simple to understand. It gives a very prescriptive methodology for a broad cross-section of the organization, definitely heavy focus on the security organization, but it also prompts the rest of the organization, right? Security is a shared responsibility, and building a strong security capability is going to sit with a traditional security team, with the InfoSec team, with the operations team, with the infrastructure team. And what Nist does is it gives towers where different excellence and capabilities can be built. For example, identifying your assets, making sure that you have a protection mechanism, understanding criticality of your assets, building some priorities around what you would recover, and then incrementally building additional capabilities such as detection capabilities, right? And that's an area where we are starting to see some significant shift. In the last 2 decades, detection really meant you run a virus scan, you run intrusion detection systems. But malwares are getting very sophisticated. It's polymorphic, it's changing all the time. So the notion of zero-day malware continues to exist, and customers are looking for more and more sophisticated, data-driven ways of finding potential infection through behavioral analytics. So that's where detection plays in. And then we have response, right? Response is all about how prepared is the organization, roles and responsibilities, what happens during an incident, followed by recovery. So we have seen Nist being one of the predominant security frameworks that customers are adopting, and they're building various controls across the Nist framework. And clearly in the last 2 years, there's been a heavy focus on the recovery side. Carol, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that additionally, when you see some of the regulatory guidance, it aligns with that National Institute of Standards or Nist framework as well. Really calling out that some of the best protections of your data are to have an offline immutable copy of your data to be able to refer to be able to use to inform a recovery. I think Adam brought up earlier the Maersk example. And, they were widely affected, but their downtime was really greatly reduced because they had an accidental air gap. They had one of their data centers was offline at the time of the attack. And once they understood that, they were able to use that data center to help seed some of the other data centers and bring back their environment. So we can look at real concrete examples where having data in an offline capability has really been helpful. And I think the other thing that you brought up that I want to highlight, Arun, is the need for cooperation across different areas of an organization, having security and IT really working together with the business to make sure that once the threat has been identified, we spend the right time to understand what business operations or business processes are critical and make sure that those are protected from an IT point of view, because that's really generally where the solutioning is going to happen, and that you're not just capturing what was identified, but all the dependencies on those things that were identified.
What you're saying is there's a bigger emphasis on business process recovery, not just data recovery.
Yeah, so when we look at an overall capability, right, when you're identifying what's important, you typically start at the business process level. And then from there, you would say, okay, what applications support the business process? What systems support those applications? What data is critical for those systems? And the protection starts at that data layer. Without that data, you don't have the ability for all those other things, but it really starts at the data layer, then goes to the systems, the applications, and the business process. So the identification comes from the business process in, the protection comes from the data back out to the business process. And that's true for both cyber recovery and disaster recovery. So if you have a strong disaster recovery program, that can often help you and get a leg up into creating a robust cyber recovery program, because you've gone through a lot of that difficult work of identifying what those core key business processes are, and have some tiering already that you can leverage to help you protect key data and capabilities in a cyber recovery vault.
So really, to net it out, lots to consider when determining the contents of how you're protecting to enable recovery. So that sounds like an area that I guess is open to interpretation for each individual business. So obviously they need to kind of interpret things their own ways. But so generally, when we're kind of helping customers work through this type of strategy and the effort in order to enable the recovery. What's specific to recovery methodology? So again, we talked a little bit about Nist as kind of a top-level cybersecurity framework, but diving specifically into the recovery aspect and to enable, to make sure that we capture all the various points that you've made. How are we helping customers measure themselves? Is it we've got maturity modeling, but can we talk about that a little bit? I think some of the aspects you've talked about reflect those of a highly mature organization, but trying to understand exactly how to get from point A to point B is, I think something that a lot are really looking to understand a little bit better.
Yeah, so what we see is that you want to make sure that you have a place to start and that you position yourself for the ability to mature over time. So at the core of it is you want to make sure that you have your data protected. Then you can start to look at analytics and finding early indicators of compromise. And then you want to look at your ability to be able to recover and maybe look at what you can do inside of a vault to validate recovery and make sure that you're capable of exercising those processes and comfortable and confident in your ability to recover. Arun?
Yeah, I agree, Carol. What we have seen is a crawl, walk, run approach. The cyber recovery solution is unique in some ways, as in there is a unique process and methodology that customers have to adopt from a recovery perspective. So when we look at traditional operational or disaster recovery, everything is well understood, right? You find the point of where the problem occurs, and there are specific procedures that allow you to just recover back the business, applications, and data. From a cyber recovery perspective, what we find is the recovery process is a little bit more complex, right? So we don't want to typically get the infection back into production. So when we think of a critical incident response plan for cyber recovery, we start with incident response. We look at, we want to do some forensics on what happened, where did the infection come from, have we identified the source, and then we do damage assessment. And the damage assessment is a critical step where we identify the extent of the damage and what sort of recovery methodology would we want to use. So going back to what Carol said, your starting point is to have protected data in an air-gapped cyber vault. That is step one. But where we mature customers is their ability to recover fast and recover at scale. That's where we are going to attach or tie the business process level recovery to the data in the vault and apply the different principles or techniques that are necessary for recovery. As an example, in a typical cyber recovery scenario, you may be able to, if you identify the problem and you know for sure, you may be able to restore data. In some cases, you may have to repair the data before you send it back to production. And in some other cases, you may just not identify the source and you want to have automation, you want to have processes that could potentially repave some smaller environments for you. So there are a lot of considerations that need to happen from a recovery standpoint.
Yeah, and I think that we're really kind of coming back to some of the things that Adam brought up earlier. And the other thing that I'm starting to see really play into this is really starting to look at those analytics, kind of that second piece here, as a way to kind of catch things earlier and give you some insight as to when your last known good data is. So, for example, if you have copies coming in every day and they're being locked, and so you have normally we see people keeping somewhere between 7 and 31 days of daily copies for their critical data in a vault. And so if you see a copy come in and you run the analytics and it looks like there's increased entropy, it indicates that there's really been some compromise on one of the files in your system, it can mark that file and say, okay, this is suspect, and it would show you that the copy that came in the previous day is the last known good. So as the analytics gets more and more powerful, it can really help us in short circuiting some of the effort that it takes to find, okay, was that copy good? No, that one has some indicators of compromise. Let's go to the previous one. Let's go to the previous one. When you start to involve the analytics as part of the process, it really helps you identify which copy to use to help to repopulate your environment. So that's something that we've seen rapidly maturing in our customers' environments.
That sounds like an awesome technology foundation you've kind of both talked about there, whether it be technologies provided through automation, immutability and air gapping, or whether it be related to more Carol on the analytics side of understanding what's come into the vault, understanding how that may be impacted in production, and then what the ramifications to recovery efforts may be. So That's great. But so when we're talking about recovery programs, and we talked a little bit about program maturity, it sounded like what you were saying is that when we get the business tighter with the recovery efforts, so when you really go through and make those business application level decisions in terms of protection recovery, that's really when organizations start maturing further. Where are we generally seeing people today? I mean, we talked a little bit about a starting point and ending point in terms of recovery, but in terms of maturity, like I think where are we generally seeing customers today, and where are we seeing that they would like to go, whether that's based on their own kind of goals and ideas, or based on some of their regulatory concerns as well. Again, where are we generally seeing them today, and how are they advancing by adding some of these types of considerations in when they're building out a cyber recovery program?
If you just look at cyber recovery maturity, right, I'm not talking about the overall cybersecurity maturity, just from a recovery standpoint, which is, if I were to ask the question, if you were to have a devastating attack, what is the impact to your organizations? So on a scale of kind of 0 and 5, where 0 is this is going to be incredibly devastating, and 5 is, you know what, I will be able to recover rather quickly with very minimal impact. We find that most customers are somewhere between 0 and 1 today, right? They may have some data protection, traditional data protection, but we know from examples and other attacks that, again, going back to the dwell time of a malware, the bad guys are able to recon your environment well enough for them to execute a devastating attack on your environment. So for most of these customers, and some of them we have actually worked with customers that have had this problem, what we find is the integrity of their data is questionable, the integrity of their network is questionable, the integrity of their servers is questionable, and it takes a while for organizations to recover back. So our position on helping customers with this is, how do we get you somewhere between 0 and 1 to 3, so you have an established program that is tailored for cyber recovery, right? It has all these special considerations. It has technologies, and you spoke of the immutability, right? Immutability is the ability to protect integrity of data once you write it until the specific retention period. These are special technologies available with some specific hardware that enables you to do it. When we look at different threat vectors that affect organizations, and when you build a cyber solution, how do you hide that solution from the eyes of the bad guys, right? At what layer does replication happen? All of these factors go into considerations on building this wall. And when you build this air gap cyber wall that we're talking about, it gets you to 3, because now you have an established protection that is away from the hands of the bad guys. It's air gap for most of the day, and you have data that you need for recovery. And then from there, we work our way upward to increase the maturity.
Carol,
Yes.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, you flashed up a slide, kind of showing a little bit more about some of the technology we've been talking about here. Just to, kind of explain this out a little bit further, I'm just, we've talked about air gapping, we've talked about immutability and automation, and how some of those aspects have been tied together by a solution that we have, we at Dell have, in order that kind of ties all that together. Can you kind of talk to this a little bit? I think, while traditional disaster recovery may be pretty well understood out there, as those programs have been built up over time, and there have been people managing those and understanding those, I think this is a fairly new concept, both integrating many of those technologies into one major piece part, as well as kind of some around the automated air gapping. So if you could just talk to this a little bit, I think that would be really good. Really just talk about how we're tying all this together.
Yeah, so when we look at cyber recovery, preserving your ability to recover, we look for a couple of key components. The first is that we have some isolation, both physically and from a network point of view, of key data. The second is that it's really not changeable, even by somebody with administrator access or rights. The third is that you have a way of analyzing the data that you protect to see whether there's been any indicators of compromise, or give yourself a little bit better confidence that the data is good for recovery. And then the last is those processes to enable recoverability. And that's all supported by an underlying infrastructure that accomplishes those things. So if we look at most organizations, here on the left, you have a normal production data center where you're running servers, and it can be everything from x86 to ZOS. But the servers have associated data from specific applications. There's a subset of that, kind of indicated by the green, that is critical, or what we might call represent your lifeboat or your minimal viable company. If you needed to survive, what would you need to survive? And once that's identified, you have that in both the storage side, as well as you take regular backups, a subset of those backups are also critical. Where most solutions come into play is to take a copy of that backup data and bring it into a vault, typically once a day. So it would be backup to backup connectivity. Bring the data into the vault. Once the data is in, the door gets closed, and the data that's in the vault, we make a copy of that, lock that, and then perform the analytics on it. And so all that is happening based on management that's in the cyber recovery vault. So the door can only be opened from the inside. And the only connectivity of that vault is back to the storage that it's talking to. So it is a direct replication connection. And other than that, it's really isolated. If you need to be able to recover, we can then take the data from the vault and bring it back into the production environment for recovery at a high level. Most of the solutions in play today are focused on the backup layer. We do have flexibility where, depending on your need to protect copies at different intervals, we might look at doing specific protection of very finite amounts of data at the storage layer, and we can mix and match those technologies into custom solutions. So we do have some heterogeneous vaults out there, but from a core standpoint, we've got about 400 cyber recovery vaults that we've helped implement, and the vast majority of them, over 90%, are purely looking at backup and bringing that into the vault. Did you want to say anything about this slide, Arun, or did I miss anything?
No, you captured all the key points, Carol. I do want to make one connection here, back to what Adam said at the outset. The insider attack is one of the most common and rising threat vectors. So when we build a solution like this, steps 1 through 4 that are common, that are repeatable every day, one of the unique aspects of the Dell Cyber Recovery solution is it is an automated workflow. And the reason why it's important is it requires no intervention. The replication doesn't require intervention. The air gap management doesn't. The reporting doesn't. And why this is important is, for many organizations, you can build it. You can invest some initial time and build it the right way. And once you build it, this solution will operate by itself for the most part. And it is by design. We do not want more and more operations team logging into the vault and touching the software stack or the control plane to minimize that insider threat. So this is one of the key aspects of the solution, is to maintain the process integrity through automation and automated workflows.
Yeah, and additionally, Arun, one of the other key components is that as we go through and we implement these solutions, because of that insider threat, one of the things that we do is implement processes which really necessitate dual person authentication. So if you need to get into the vault to make any modifications or changes, one person would have access to kind of get through the layer into the vault, but not have access to anything in the vault to be able to make any changes. And another person would have the access to make the changes, but can't get into the vault without the other person's help. That way you're forcing two people to cooperate, and it really reduces that insider threat of somebody's credentials being compromised or a person being compromised, and allowing something to affect what's in the vault. So that's another key component and a key aspect of how we typically focus on these implementations.
Great, thanks, Carol and Arun. That's a really great explanation of the technology here. I think there's a lot of underlying specifics of this that are really an enabling factor of what we're talking about today. I did want to ask very specifically about some of what we're seeing and some of what you touched upon in the analyze space. Now, when we talk about analyzing some of that vaulted data, I think you had previously given us kind of a little teaser in terms of what can be done there in terms of identifying copies for indicators of compromise and things like that. But is there anything else that you'd like to add on about the capabilities of that and how that helps in both protecting and then further enabling recovery?
Yeah, so I think one of the key attributes of the analysis that we go through is that we're not just reading the metadata, we're reading the metadata as well as the file data. So that really helps us look for specific patterns that really indicate indicator of compromise. So we're really looking for things like increased entropy, file names that don't match the file type, and getting smarter over time. So really employing things like AI and machine learning to understand the patterns of your business and how things are, what's expected, so that over time we'll get more and more accurate. So I think that those are all key ideas that are important when you look at analysis of data. The other thing is that the analytics that we have can read the data without rehydrating it. So essentially, it understands backup formats and can read the data in its native backup format without going through a restore process to look at that full file.
Yeah, Adam, one of the common questions I've gotten from customers is, will the cyber recovery vault prevent a malware from coming into the vault, right? So it's the opposite. We welcome malware coming into the vault, and for the reasons that Carol just explained, having malware in a nascent, inactive form, in an inert form, in the form of backups in the vault, allows us to go inspect it. And with a technology like CyberSense, without hydrating the data, right? Remember, only when you restore an image of an operating system and you boot up the server is when malwares start acting up. So in a nascent backup format, our CyberSense technology allows us to inspect the data, which is really a huge game changer from an AI ML analytics perspective. And it can run over 28 different heuristics to find indicators of compromise. And again, like I said, we are seeing more and more CISOs leaning towards behavioral analytics going on in the environment, and they're increasing different observability of applications, of infrastructure, of patterns, of communication, of usage, who's logging in. All of this kind of new age data-driven model is what's really helping the CISOs combat this modern threat.
That's great. So, how does that tool? You mentioned some of the things it's doing, but what kind of technologies does that employ just to be able to, be actively running and best identify what's going on in the vault?
So typically, CyberSense is doing inline ingestion of the data coming in. It then indexes the information. And then it performs live streaming analytics, right? So it is running on pretty powerful servers. And some of our PowerEdge servers can keep up, contain that kind of horsepower to run inline analytics for terabytes and terabytes of data coming in every night. So it is caught up. And the other aspect of this is it's also learning algorithms. So when you initially deploy CyberSense in the environment, it's starting to understand patterns, right? It is looking for behaviors of specific files. How do they behave over time? Is it normal for a file to grow in size, shrink, and what is the factor of the shrinkage or growth? So it takes some time for CyberSense to start building a good profile of your environment. And as time goes on, the analytics gets crisper and crisper and less false positives in the environment.
That's awesome. Sounds like a great piece of technology. So lots of machine learning in there too, kind of learning the environment after it's had a chance to start ingesting data and understanding that. So, so I think one of the keys there that you highlighted on that I'd like to kind of move forward with is that this technology is key in making sure that what's being brought back out, if a recovery effort needs to take place, is clean and ready for recovery. There's I think those two technologies, whether it be the CyberSense application or if it's the the Power Protect or storage-based cyber recovery solutions, I think those represent a very strong technology-based foundation that we can then go and build on further. So again, to pull back in some of the conversation around maturity modeling and understanding, where you are today, where you need to go, operationalizing those beyond just those base technologies. Again, creating a foundation for a recovery platform. What do we really do to kind of additionally build that out further? Again, we talked a little bit earlier about some of the considerations that need to be made, but specifically, when we're talking about enabling customers to recover, Carol, you mentioned a great topic, and I think a great term we're using now is that how do we help them understand exactly what it's going to take to build that minimum viable company in the vault? What does that generate look like? Obviously, every customer is going to be different. Their business requirements are different, and everything that we're needing to do for them in order to tailor that solution would be different. But generally, I imagine there's some amount of similarity between them. If you wouldn't mind just kind of touching on that a little bit, I think the operationalization of those technologies is really key.
Yeah, so in general, when we look at what goes in a vault, you really, again, there's a good ability to be able to do what Arun really called crawl, walk, run. So initially, you really would start with something where you are protecting data, getting it locked, making sure that you have options if something were to happen. The next piece is that analytics piece and starting to do the analysis and understand what data is good and giving you more confidence in the data that you have in the vault. And kind of that last piece on the maturity is to take the data in the vault and to really look at recovery, what recovery would look like. So the other pieces that we typically see are that organizations will put a subset of their servers in the vault to allow them to test recovery. So that means whatever your backup software is, you would want a copy of that in your vault so that you could do restores. So we would typically enable something we would call a clean room. So the ability to have kind of a vault within a vault to isolate specific environments, to be able to restore both data and servers in a specific smaller subset of the vault to go through and test your procedures to enable you to run forensics if you have an event actually happen, and really look at what that might look like on a regular basis. So some of the typical terms you might hear in that space are things like a data landing zone, so a place to restore data to, a clean room, which is a segregated space where you could simulate recovery of an application or two, make sure that you're comfortable with that, be able to bring something up and take a look at the data. And again, we're not talking about huge environments. We're not talking about putting in another quote DR copy, but we're talking about being able to leverage a subset of servers to enable you to have more confidence to test through procedures. In some cases, we have seen organizations have maybe some of their disaster recovery servers that they can make part of this clean room and either isolate them and attach them to a cyber recovery vault clean room, or attach them to disaster recovery to try to get a little bit more leverage out of some of those investments they already have. But that's all around making sure that you have a regular process for testing those key business processes. So again, going back to that minimal viable company, what are those things that you would need to put in the lifeboat that would be required to recover if that's really all you had left? And so it is everything else has failed. This is our lifeboat. What's in that lifeboat, and how can we test that on a regular basis to make sure that it's accurate and that we have confidence in it if we ever have to use it?
Adam, I'd like to add to what Carol said, right? Just to take a step back for the audience here. When we looked at the cyber vault connecting with production, typically what we are doing is we are replicating data into the cyber vault. We designed the cyber vault replication to the point where we expect replication to take no more than an hour or two in the night. So think of the cyber vault is isolated for majority of a 24-hour day, right? Upwards of 22 to 22 hours. So part of analytics is increasing the return of investment on the vault. You're not just copying data and leaving it there, you're making sense out of it. The other option is return of investment is the minimum viable testing that you would build in the vault, which is enough test servers to support maybe one application test. And this is important because when we talk to customers, while customers, especially in the agile world that we live in, where services, applications are continuously released in production, we know that the immense pressure on IT operations not to have any downtime, right, to perform regular maintenance, leave alone proactive testing. So one database owner that I spoke to one time said, hey, the vault is great because I can run a bunch of DB verify commands to check the schema and integrity of my database that I could never run in production because operations would not allow me the downtime. So we are, when we built a cyber vault, step one, we have protected data. It is air gap. It's away from the hands of the bad guys. Step two, we run analytics. We get better data-driven insight. Step three is where we start focusing on a testing program, and we encourage app owners and database owners to create automated testing in the vault that they would normally not have the opportunity to do in production. Again, coming from very aggressive uptime requirements.
Great. So so what it sounds like is that there's really a whole host of considerations that need to be made to ensure that the program is holistic and enables all the right different piece parts for recovery. So Carol, you mentioned earlier that we've done this with a number of customers, really again operationalizing technologies to create a bigger recovery program. We've engaged with them on over the past number of years or so to help build those out, and we've gained a tremendous amount of insight by working with them, whether that be industry focused stuff about whether it's regulations or simply just what they care about protecting. Can we talk a little bit about what we've learned in whether it be certain industries, how they're addressing cyber recovery, any you'd like to kind of cue in on, and then just any big lessons that we've learned through those. Obviously, I think there's some streamlining that we're able to do in helping customers and meeting them at a level that they understand, in terms of in their industry. But just wanted to talk about that a little bit further because I think we've learned some really great things.
Yeah. So when you look at kind of the history of cyber recovery and more of the focus on that, it really started right after the Sony attack. So 5 or so years ago, essentially that really brought home to a lot of organizations how vulnerable organizations as a whole were, as well as some of the protections that we had kind of taken for granted from an IT point of view. If you ask most organizations, in general, in our day-to-day operations, we're taking so many copies of our data that you think surely there must be a good copy somewhere, right? We take snapshots, the DBAs take their own copies and squirrel them away. We take backups. Sometimes the backups go off site, but they're all connected and part of the same network, and they're all cataloged and those kinds of things. And so if somebody has the ability to affect your catalog or your actual backups or do things, it can really wreak havoc. So that's really where this whole thing started. And so essentially when Cyber Recovery Solutions first started, it was really technology and more customized scripting and those kinds of things. Around 2018, we took all of the experience that we had with customers implementing these custom approaches and productized it into a cyber recovery product. And since then, we're releasing new copies of the product about once a quarter. So we're constantly keeping up with what's happening in the marketplace. And if you look at how organizations make decisions, the first piece is really around advice and what do you need to protect? How do you protect it? Where do you put the vault? How am I actually going to connect? So that kind of high level view, as well as, hey, what VLAN am I going to use to do this function? You want to make sure all those things are taken care of. And Dell has really helped a number of organizations go through that process to understand what to protect and how to protect it. And then the secondary process around implementing the solution from both a technology standpoint, as well as starting to get those key processes in place and setting them up for future development. If we look at some of the key industries, initially we saw a lot of activity in a couple of main industries, and that was around financial services, healthcare, and energy. Those are probably the areas where we saw the most initial adoption. Then there was an incident on more of the legal side, and so we saw a bunch of legal firms join. In general now, it's industry agnostic. Everybody can kind of see themselves in some of the issues that have happened. And what we see spikes according to maybe some organizations and the partners that they use on a regular basis and their ability to see themselves. So, for example, after a healthcare breach in the Northeast, there were a number of different hospital systems that really chipped in and tried to help that other hospital that had been affected recover, but then went ahead and made changes themselves because they were able to see themselves reflected in that breach that had happened. Additionally, if you look at earlier this year, there was a large-scale kind of services solution provider that was affected, and you can see a lot of the organizations that worked with that provider, even if they didn't have services that were provided by them, started to see themselves. And so as these attacks become public, it brings up a discussion topic in a lot of boardrooms and a lot of executive sessions to discuss, hey, what are we doing? What's our ability to protect ourselves? What are the options that we have? And really looking to understand that better. So Arun, I don't know if you want to talk about a specific industry or two.
Sure, Carol. I think the bottom line is the stakes are really, really high, right? When we spoke about the Maersk attack, and again, for all the listeners here, we generally do not use company names that are affected. We are only talking about publicly available information. So I just want you to be cognizant. But if you look at the Maersk situations, Maersk manages all the terminals in the world, right? Imagine if that automatic or by chance air gap had not happened and they did not recover for weeks, we would have looked at a possible global economy collapse, right? When we talk about hospitals, we have patients' lives at stake, and I mean there is very little room for error here for companies to make this investment. And likewise, energy is the backbone of the country, right? We have worked with many utility firms. They're under heavy pressure because they're always looking more vulnerable to state actors on the national grid. So I don't think any company is spared from this. And we have seen, like Carol said, we have seen this go from large financials with regulatory pressures now to smaller down market companies, even though they have no regulatory bodies telling them to go do it. They're just reading the news, and they're seeing their peers being affected, and they don't want to be in that state.
Wow. So really, a couple of key takeaways there. It really sounds like, so first of all, we're seeing people react when their competitors are being hit. They're like, oh wow, we don't want that to be us next. And then it really sounds like that almost having a solution like this could enable almost a competitive differentiator for some of those organizations, just being able to quickly recover and really not have to have their name in the news about having an attack, and you start bringing in reputational damage and all the other sorts of other associated damage with that. So it sounds like there's a lot of different activity and forces in the market, whether those be regulatory or just kind of corporate driven.
The good news is our Dell Cyber solution is not targeted for any high-end or low-end industry, right? This is a very scalable solution, both from a product perspective as well as services perspective. We can go help any customer regardless of their size and where they are.
Carol, Arun, we've worked with a ton of different customers across a ton of different industries, helping them, really apply their business needs to a cyber recovery plan. Do you have any favorites that you'd like to mention? Just maybe some of the specific aspects we were able to work with them on, we won't necessarily talk about any names here, but just any that you thought were a good example of some of the capabilities that customers really need to be enabling to be ready to recover.
So for the wrong reasons, our favorites are the companies that we have worked with that have been affected, right? So we really were part of the recovery process. We understood that, when we think of protecting applications and data, that's what most people think. But in reality, from a cyber attack, when we worked with these customers that were affected globally, there were information across the data center that had to be recovered, right? Configuration of switches, AD, DNS, authentication, certificates, even repositories where runbooks sit, where do Splunk logs sit. There's a whole universe of information that companies have today, and working with these companies that were affected gave us better insights of what a real life recovery process looks like. Carol?
Yeah, I think, when I look at some of my favorites, it's organizations that have taken the basic structure of getting data protected and kind of advanced it or done something creative with it. So work with one utility or energy company that had was doing this whole cyber recovery process at the same time as they were advancing their overall disaster recovery process. So they had really invested time in bundling and understanding key business processes that needed to work together and what those minimal bundles really looked like. And then when it came time to implement the cyber recovery piece, what they did was they were able to leverage their lab and essentially infrastructure as code to rebuild environments quickly and then just restore some key specific data. And so that to me was a good, interesting use case for how they were able to leverage kind of new capabilities in a cyber recovery vault. And the experience in doing it in the cyber recovery vault then enabled them to do it at a broader scale externally out of the vault, use that infrastructure as code to rebuild environments rather than recover and really focusing recovery on the key data that they needed, not on the operational environments.
Wow. That's a great story. Lots of cool technologies. It sounds like were worked into that to, to your point, not only address their immediate cyber recovery needs, but also kind of up level that into an overall, resiliency plan that helped them, mitigate downtime from really any origin. We had a great discussion today. Thank you all so much for your time. I think there's a lot going on in the cyber recovery space, and it was great to kind of hear your perspective on that.